Ash cools fast, but secrets take far longer to fade. In the autumn of 1307, the Knights Templar, an order once feared and admired across Christendom, were seized in a single dawn sweep across France. Their leaders were dragged from their beds, their halls sealed, their coffers emptied. The king and pope declared the order finished, and yet, history is rarely so neat. What if those arrests were not an ending, but a disguise for something else? What if behind every burned parchment and shuttered chapel, there lingered a trail of hidden vaults, unspoken oaths, and heirs who carried the flame in silence? When we look closely at the family trees with suspicious gaps, at the coats of arms with faint red crosses that refuse to vanish, at sea maps edged with unexplained symbols, we find the suggestion of a brotherhood that did not die, but slipped into shadow. Could it be that the Templars never truly disappeared, but instead learned how to survive in plain sight? Did they embed themselves in bloodlines, in whispered vows at weddings, in the architecture of chapels no one visits after dusk? Or were these only accidents of history, misread by eyes too eager for mystery? Tonight we will follow those traces, not through the loud pages of official chronicles, but through the quiet margins where stone remembers what paper forgets. We will listen to symbols carved on forgotten tombs, to heraldry altered but never erased, to the small details that scholars still debate. And perhaps, in the stillness before sleep, you may feel the same question that has haunted centuries. Were the Templars truly extinguished, or do they still keep watch beneath other names? So settle in. Let your thoughts drift like candle smoke. And if you find this journey worth keeping alive, please like, share, and subscribe. Your small gesture helps us keep unfolding these midnight histories. And now let us return to that first cold morning in Paris, October 1307. When the doors began to close softly, and the order's great disappearance began. The city of Paris in October 1307 was not awake when the first boots struck the cobblestones. The bells had not yet tolled for morning prayers, the bakers had not yet lit their ovens, and the river fog still clung to the Seine like a winding shroud. Yet within the royal palace, orders had already been sealed. Philip IV, King of France, known as Philip the Fair, had resolved to do what no enemy on the battlefield had achieved: to break the Knights Templar. For nearly 2 centuries, the Order of the Temple had been both warrior and banker, defenders of the Holy Land and custodians of Europe's treasure. They built fortresses along pilgrimage routes, offered letters of credit that allowed a traveler to exchange coin in Paris and redeem it in Acre, and commanded fleets that sailed not only to Crusader ports, but into commercial harbors. By 1307, however, the Crusades had withered. Jerusalem was long lost, and the order had grown wealthy in lands, rents, and influence. Their power drew suspicion, and their independence, answering only to the Pope, stirred resentment in a monarch hungry for gold. The mainstream historical fact is stark. On October 13, 1307 at dawn, coordinated arrests of Templars were carried out across France. Men who had once charged into Saracen ranks at Hatton or stood guard over the sepulchre of Christ now woke to the rattle of chains and the press of soldiers at their door. The official charges, heresy, blasphemy, obscene rituals, were announced with the authority of crown and church, though whispered confessions later proved born of torture. But history rarely confines itself to the proclamations of kings. In the quieter corners of the record, there lingers a curious detail. Some vaults were already empty when the king's men arrived. Inventories meant to tally seized treasure noted fewer items than expected. A sealed room beneath the temple in Paris contained no troves of coin, no reliquaries, only dust and markings on the floor where trunks had once stood. Chroniclers puzzled at the absence, but the matter slipped into rumor. Did the order anticipate its own downfall? Were wagons dispatched in the nights before the arrests, rolling silently through the mist to destinations unknown? The debated detail lies here. Some historians argue the missing wealth was overstated, that the order's riches existed more on parchment in rents and debts than in gold. Yet others point to ship registries from La Rochelle on the western coast, recording vessels that vanished from record, just as the arrests took place inland. The idea of a midnight fleet, laden with treasure and men, sailing toward Scotland or Portugal, has become legend. Skeptics dismiss it as romantic fantasy. Dreamers keep the image alive of red crosses, fading into fog over an endless sea. What matters in this opening moment is less the weight of coins than the weight of silence. For as the arrests rang out, as torches lit the narrow Parisian alleys, not every night was taken. Some were away on errands, others warned in whispers, still others spirited out by sympathetic allies. Among them, according to one apocryphal tale, was a commander who entrusted his nephews with a seal, instructing them to keep the mark, though never the name. It is a fringe story, never substantiated, yet its symbolism endures. That identity might be erased, but continuity could pass like a candle flame from one hand to another. Imagine the sensory landscape of that morning. Cold air stiffened wool cloaks, iron keys clanged against locks, and the metallic taste of fear rode every breath. Horses stamped in courtyards as prisoners were herded out, their mantles stripped, their swords confiscated. In hidden chapels, candles burned to stubs as brothers prayed in chains, while beyond the walls, the ordinary people of Paris awoke to rumors that their protectors were in fact blasphemers. The paradox is powerful. Guardians turned accused, piety recast as poison. The motif of the seal begins here. The wax impression that once authorized land sales, loans, and treaties became instead a symbol of survival. For a seal does not speak the name of its bearer. It imprints an emblem that can pass beyond identity. Keep the seal, the story says, and the vow endures even if the surname is lost. This is where bedtime rhythm settles. The arrests are loud, but the silence afterward is heavier. Behind shuttered windows, noble patrons reconsidered their alliances. In abbeys, monks copied hurried notes into margins. Somewhere in the Loire Valley, a Templar messenger rode with no banner, only a small bundle of documents tucked in waxed leather. The horse's breath steamed in the air, and every hoofbeat sounded like a countdown to vanishing. The quirky detail is in the king's own superstition. Philip, known for his sharp features and cold calculation, had a belief in omens. Chronicles tell us he scheduled the arrests for Friday the 13th, not merely for coordination, but because he considered the date unlucky. To his enemies, this irony deepened when he himself died within a decade, struck down not by blade, but by sudden illness. The day of the arrests later tangled with the modern Friday the 13th superstition, an alluring echo, though historians debate the link. As the first section closes, the imagery shifts. The city wakes, yet something has already disappeared. A door has closed softly behind men who did not wait to be chained, and their footprints lead into shadows unmarked on any map. The story has just begun, and silence has already become its loudest voice. The dawn raids of 1307 reverberated across France like the toll of an iron bell, but even in the echoes of chains, there were absences. When the king's officers pried open Templar commanderies, they often found something strange. Trunks already bare, records missing, cupboards swept clean. It was as if someone had moved quietly ahead of them, closing doors with deliberate care. The mainstream historical fact is recorded plainly in royal inventories. When Philip's men catalogued the seized goods, they expected vast heaps of coin, chalices heavy with jewels, and reliquaries of great worth. Instead, they listed modest sums, livestock, furnishings, and farmland deeds. It was disappointing, considering the order's reputation for immense wealth. Chroniclers of the time, some sympathetic, some hostile, noted the surprise. Where was the fortune that had made kings envious and merchants indebted? The absence left behind a vacuum that quickly filled with speculation. One possibility, accepted by sober historians, is that the order's wealth was exaggerated. Their real treasure lay in networks of credit, debts owed by nobles, fees for safe passage, and estates tied up in long leases. Gold was seldom stacked in coffers. It was scattered across Europe in parchment obligations. The arrests disrupted administration, not mountains of coin. But then comes the fringe detail, the rumors of wagons rolling at night. In several French towns, tavern stories recalled carts covered in canvas, guarded by armed men without banners, leaving shortly before the dawn of October 13th. Some claimed these convoys carried bullion toward the coast, others that they bore relics too holy to fall into hostile hands. The roads were many, the witnesses few, but the image endured. A caravan retreating into mist like veins of treasure flowing underground. The debated element concerns the port of La Rochelle. Merchant logs suggest Templar ships were stationed there in 1307, vessels capable of reaching England, Iberia, or even Scotland. After the arrests, those ships vanish from records. No confiscations are listed, no battles reported. They simply slip from documentation. Did they leave under cover of night, sails inked with red crosses blending into fog? Or did clerks simply fail to note their transfer to royal control? Historians argue both sides, yet the mystery lingers like salt air on the skin. Shipping ledgers are patchy. What's missing may be movement, or just paper. Imagine, if you will, the silence of those emptied vaults. Stone floors marked with drag lines where chests had been pulled away. Walls bearing faint outlines where icons once hung. The soldiers entering must have felt the oddness, the hollowness of conquest without spoil. One chronicler compared it to a feast where the table had been cleared, but the plates still smelled of meat. It is in such sensory traces that legends begin to root. The motif of silence as strategy emerges here. A door closed softly does not slam. It deceives the ear, leaving the passerby uncertain whether the room beyond is empty or merely asleep. The Templars, so the tale goes, mastered this art. Their disappearance was not loud but hushed, a vanishing that felt almost courteous. To the captors, this quiet evasion was infuriating. To later generations, it appeared almost mystical. There is also a quirky note in one surviving French account. A clerk in Poitiers complained that his office received keys without doors. Among the confiscated items were iron keys to unknown chests or cellars, their matching locks nowhere to be found. The symbolism writes itself, tools of entry to spaces now concealed or destroyed. Were the Templars mocking their pursuers, leaving behind riddles of absence? Or were these simply spare iron left without context? Either way, the image of keys without doors haunts the imagination like a puzzle box, missing its lid. The debated question grows larger. Was this deliberate myth-making by the Order? A final sleight of hand to preserve their reputation as keepers of secrets? Or was it the projection of later romantic imaginations, retrofitting mystery into mundane gaps of record? For bedtime storytelling, it hardly matters which. The uncertainty is the fertile ground in which the story breathes, and the listener leans closer in the dark, wondering which door has yet to open. Picture the sensory detail of La Rochelle, if indeed the ships departed there. The gulls wheel above, their cries harsh in the dawn. The tide laps at the piers and ropes creak as sails unfurl. A monk in a nearby cloister writes his morning psalm, unaware that a caravan from inland has delivered crates to the harbor. The scent of salt mingles with tar, and the men work in silence, knowing each word spoken could betray them. The ships ease into the mist, heading for open waters. Whether this happened in truth or only in imagination, the scene feels inevitable in the marrow of legend. The motif of the seal reappears here too, for in one inventory, a chest confiscated in Champagne contained not gold, but a bag of wax impressions. They bore the Order's red cross within circles, ready to stamp parchment with authority. To the royal scribes it seemed trivial, but to those who study symbols, it suggests continuity beyond material wealth. A seal can create new documents, new claims, even new identities. If the Templars carried little else into exile, carrying their seal would have been enough to preserve legitimacy. As the section slows toward its close, imagine again those soft doors, wooden planks easing shut, iron hinges groaning gently, then stillness. The men who fled left not only treasure, but memory. They became whispers in genealogies, gaps in land charters, anomalies in heraldic design. They traded presence for absence, visibility for survival. The quirky clerk with his keys without doors gives us a final image. What if history itself is such a key? A tool we hold, heavy and cold, while the door it once opened no longer exists. And yet we keep it, turning it in our palms, convinced that somewhere the lock remains. From here, the path leads not to wealth, but to lineage. For what cannot be stored in coffers may be carried in names, in marriages, in blood that remembers. The soft doors close behind us, and ahead lies the hush of forgotten family trees, waiting to be read like maps. The Paris arrests shook Europe like thunder rolling across a flat plain, yet the storm did not sweep away every trace. What endured was not always coin or fortress, but the smaller things, the things that fit in a saddlebag or a folded cloak. Rings, seals, scraps of parchment, even whispered instructions. In these fragments, some believe they might lay the true survival of the Templar spirit, not in armies, but in lineage. The mainstream historical fact is clear enough. After the dissolution of the order in 1312, the Pope officially transferred much of the Templar property to the Knights Hospitaller. Castles, churches, and estates were granted to another military order, ensuring continuity of function, if not of name. Yet in practice, transfers were uneven, regional, resisted, and often delayed. Many local lords resisted handing over lands. Some properties vanished into crown holdings, and in certain corners of Europe, the Hospitallers received less than parchment decrees promised. Into this confusion crept the possibility of survival, for where records are broken, stories thrive. The fringe detail, passed down in anecdote, tells of a Templar commander who, before his arrest, summoned his young nephews to a hidden chamber. He pressed into their hands a signet seal, red wax already hardened on its base, and told them to forget the family name, but never to forget the mark. The tale has the shape of folklore, children, exile, a relic of authority. It may be invention, but it resonates because it captures a deeper truth. Names are fragile, symbols endure. A name may be forbidden, but a seal leaves its impression long after its bearer is gone. The debated element arises from heraldic studies. Across the 15th and 16th centuries, certain noble families suddenly adopted devices once linked with the temple: cross pate, twin eagles, red bands across silver fields. Critics insist this was coincidence, or the natural borrowing of symbols common in medieval Europe. Yet others suspect a quieter transmission, that widows, cousins, or hidden heirs carried seals into new marriages, and with them, a right to incorporate forgotten emblems into fresh coats of arms. Was this cultural memory or deliberate inheritance? Scholars disagree, and in the soft disagreement, the imagination drifts. Picture a household after the arrests. The Templar lands are seized, the brothers imprisoned, but in the manner of a sympathetic cousin, a locked chest remains. Inside lies no treasure, only wax seals, a handful of letters, and perhaps a ledger of debts owed. To the untrained eye, it is mundane. To the family, it is a passport to legitimacy. A seal can create contracts, enforce claims, even issue commands in absentia. With one, a family might continue the work of guardianship without ever naming the order again. The sensory detail makes it vivid. Imagine the smell of beeswax melted and pressed into circles, the sharp tang of iron tools used to stamp a cross or eagle, the feel of parchment smoothed flat beneath the hand. The candle gutters in the draught, and a child watches, as an elder shows how to press the seal and hold it firm until the wax cools. It is not wealth in the ordinary sense, but it carries the weight of authority and the continuity of memory. A quirky fact emerges from Burgos, Spain. In the 19th century, restorers claim to have found a collection of seals hidden in a crypt. Some bore designs identical to Templar motifs. Beside them was a scrap of parchment with the line, "Though our names have changed, the mark remains." Was it a forgery? Possibly. Was it romantic fabrication? Perhaps. But it echoed the legend of nephews told to keep the seal, weaving folklore into material discovery. Whether authentic or apocryphal, it speaks to the persistent fascination with the idea that continuity can be preserved not through armies, but through symbols. Here the motif of inheritance begins to shift. In earlier moments, the seal was authority over land and debt. Now it becomes inheritance through silence. To keep the seal meant not merely to hold an object, but to carry forward a charge. It was an heirloom of responsibility, reminding the bearer of a story whispered, never written. The debated question is whether this inheritance truly altered history. Did families who possessed such relics consciously align themselves with a hidden legacy? Or did later antiquarians project the weight of romance onto what were merely curiosities? Perhaps both. Yet even if only half believed, the idea shaped behavior. To claim a link with the temple gave aura, mystery, and gravitas. Nobles cherished symbols precisely because they hinted at continuity with a lost brotherhood. Imagine the sensory environment of a wedding where such inheritance was displayed. The bride's gown embroidered with subtle red thread in the lining, the groom wearing a ring carved with a cross, faint enough to pass unnoticed. Guests feast on roast meats and spiced wine, unaware that symbols are being carried into the next generation. In this way, memory is smuggled inside celebration, like a secret folded into bread. The quirky detail continues in heraldry. In several family trees, coats of arms suddenly acquire unexplained quarters. A red cross on a dark field, a small emblem with no recorded marriage to justify its presence. Some heralds dismissed it as decorative liberty, but others noted the persistence of such marks across centuries. They were like genetic markers, carried not in blood tests, but in banners. As this section winds down, consider again the whispered instruction, keep the seal. It is both literal and symbolic. Literal, because the wax and metal devices could survive in trunks and vaults. Symbolic, because to keep the seal is to keep the vow, even if the vow is no longer spoken aloud. The door closes softly here, not with chains, but with inheritance. Behind it lie names forgotten. Ahead lie genealogies waiting to be read. We follow those faint red threads into the next silence, the gaps and blank lines in pedigrees where someone has been carefully written out. The silence of the Templars did not only echo in emptied vaults or vanished ships, it also slipped into the parchment of family records. Medieval Europe adored lineage. Monks copied genealogies with careful ink. Nobles traced descent as proof of land claims, and heralds kept rolls of arms to show the continuity of noble houses. Yet here and there, in the centuries after 1307, one finds something stranger than a scandal or a dispute. One finds nothing, blank lines where names should be. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval genealogies were imperfect, but often meticulous when property was at stake. Inheritance required proof. Lords and kings demanded documentation of who begat whom, not out of idle curiosity, but to confirm who had the right to hold castles, fields, and titles. The roles of nobility, whether in France, England, or the Holy Roman Empire, survive in abbeys and archives. They are dotted with flourishes, crests, and Latin notations. To the modern eye, they look like family trees grown sideways. Yet in some of them, entire branches vanish, not because of death, but because no names are recorded at all. The fringe detail, whispered by antiquarians, is that some of these gaps align suspiciously with regions where Templar fugitives were rumored to have fled. A German barony where heirs are unnamed for a generation, then reappear with new coats of arms. An Italian noble house where a whole decade of marriages leaves no record. Yet the family resurfaces with unusual symbols stitched into banners. Coincidence, perhaps? But to the Romantics, it suggested deliberate erasure, a way to fold outsiders into pedigrees while hiding their origins. The debated element is whether these omissions were intentional or accidental. Some historians argue the gaps simply reflect the fragility of record-keeping, documents lost to fire, plague, or disinterest. Others believe they were purposeful silences, scribes instructed to leave certain names unwritten, to protect kin who carried dangerous associations. After all, to list a Templar as your ancestor in the 14th century could invite confiscation or suspicion. Better to let the parchment breathe emptily until the danger passed. Picture the sensory world of these manuscripts. The vellum is smooth, faintly yellowed, smelling of animal hide long cured. The ink is iron gall, its lines turned brown with time. A monk copies carefully by candlelight, humming a psalm under his breath. He writes Johannes Filius and leaves the space after blank, staring at it for a moment, as if waiting for permission to continue. Then he moves on, skipping a line, continuing the tree. The blank remains as visible as any word. This blankness becomes its own symbol. In genealogy, absence is presence. A missing name is not the same as an unknown name. It is a silence that feels chosen. To the bedtime listener, it is like a pause in a song, the moment of stillness that makes the next note more haunting. A quirky anecdote arises from the archives of Naples. In the 17th century, a scholar named Pietro Colla attempted to reconstruct the family tree of a minor noble house. He grew frustrated when, for the years immediately following 1312, the record carried a marginal note some later readers paraphrased as a hidden line. Whether this was a clerical flourish or a deliberate admission remains debated. But in that phrase, modern imaginations have found a hook. A family that openly acknowledged its lineage was hidden, though not erased. The motif of blood as silence takes root here. Unlike the seal or the cross, silence leaves no physical token. It is a gap, a breath held. Yet it is powerful, because silence protects. To erase a name is to keep a life safe from accusation. To leave a blank is to leave space for a story that cannot be written, but still can be told. Debates continue among genealogists. Some argue that noble families were too proud to deliberately omit names. Pride demanded every ancestor be accounted for. Others note that the very pride of nobility might compel omission if an ancestor was tainted by charges of heresy or rebellion. Better to leave him unwritten than to stain the tree. The absence then becomes an act of curation, a pruning rather than a loss. Imagine walking through a gallery of family portraits. Frames line the wall, each with faces stern or serene, gazing down from centuries past. But one frame is empty, the canvas inside blank. The viewer lingers longer before it than before any painted visage. The absence commands attention. So too with genealogies. The gap shouts by its silence. The quirky side of this tale involves heraldry as well. In some rolls of arms, alongside complete family crests, appear shields half-finished, outlines without color, shapes without symbols. Were these merely drafts left incomplete? Or were they heraldic placeholders for lines whose emblems could not yet be safely displayed? To modern historians, they look like doodles. To storytellers, they look like doors waiting to be opened. The bedtime rhythm slows as we dwell on these gaps. Think of them as stars hidden by cloud. The constellation remains, though part is unseen. The sky does not forget, and neither does the bloodline. Silence becomes another form of ink. As this section draws to its close, return to the tactile sensation of the vellum page. The monk dips his quill, pauses at the blank space, and moves on. Centuries later, we lean over the same page and wonder what name should have filled that void. Was it a knight who fled Paris, a child raised under another crest, a woman who carried a seal hidden in her dowry? We cannot know, yet the silence itself is eloquent. And in that silence, the path forward emerges. Not just the missing names, but the new symbols that appear afterward, stitched into banners, painted on shields. From blank lines to bold colors, the story continues. The next door opens not to absence, but to heralds who spoke softly in design, where they could not speak in words. If genealogical blanks were silences in ink, heraldry became the whispers in color and shape. In medieval Europe, coats of arms were more than decoration. They were the language of lineage, a grammar of beasts and crosses, tinctures and stripes, painted on shields, stitched into banners, carved into tombstones. To those who could read them, they spoke louder than any chronicle. And in the years after the fall of the Templars, new coats of arms began to murmur with odd familiarity. The mainstream historical fact is that heraldry was formalized across Europe by the 13th and 14th centuries. Kings appointed heralds whose duty was to record arms, enforce rules of design, and preserve clarity of lineage. Heraldic roles survive in England, France, and the Holy Roman Empire, showing us lions rampant, fleur-de-lis, and countless crosses. Each symbol carried meaning, but more importantly, it anchored a family to a story. Arms passed from father to son, sometimes quartered or combined through marriage, always claiming continuity. The fringe detail arrives when scholars note peculiar adoptions of the double-headed eagle, once associated with the Holy Roman Empire, suddenly appearing in smaller noble houses in regions rumored to harbor Templar fugitives. The eagle bore crowns, scepters, orbs, but in these new coats, a red stripe or band often accompanied it. To some, this was simply fashion. Heraldry was never static. To others, it suggested a quiet inheritance, a way to smuggle Templar emblems into new lives. The debated element centers on whether these changes were deliberate continuities or mere coincidences. Skeptics argue that crosses and eagles were common motifs. Their spread proves nothing, yet the timing troubles the narrative. In Italy and along the empire's borderlands, several noble houses adopted or revived imperial birds and red accents after the suppression of the temple. Was it just artistic borrowing, or were these families protecting marriages with hidden Templar descendants? The debate remains open, and in that openness lies the allure of heraldry as secret code. Imagine the sensory experience of a medieval tournament where banners snapped in the wind above the lists. Crowds cheered as knights lowered lances, but the heralds watched the colors. One banner bore a black field slashed with red, another a cross pate tipped wide, another a double eagle whose wings spread like evening shadows. To the uninitiated, they were pretty designs. To those who remembered, they were whispers of a brotherhood that had not died. The motif of red as inheritance deepens here. Red bands, stripes, drops, often paired with darker backgrounds, appear like wounds stitched into coats of arms. They suggest not merely power, but sacrifice, not merely land, but blood. In bedtime cadence, one can imagine these red marks as echoes of the seals once pressed in wax, now painted onto shields to declare continuity without words. A quirky anecdote emerges from Germany. In the late 15th century, a minor noble family, adopted a crest showing an eagle perched above a red drop. When questioned by heralds, they claimed it honored a hunting accident in which their ancestor shed blood nobly. But local folklore insisted otherwise, that the red drop symbolized a seal passed down from a knight who fled France centuries earlier. It was a small, strange story, but one that shows how heraldry could become a stage for legends. The debated question stretches further. Were these families consciously preserving Templar identity, or did later antiquarians invent connections to add romance to otherwise ordinary crests? The evidence is ambiguous. Some heralds dismissed unusual arms as vanity, others cataloged them faithfully without comment. Yet when one sees the recurrence of specific motifs, red crosses, double eagles, stripes of blood, the imagination naturally links them back to the brotherhood that disappeared so abruptly. Visualize the stillness of a family chapel. Stained glass filters morning light onto tomb slabs carved with shields. The lines are worn, but the shapes endure. A cross within a circle, an eagle with wings raised. The air smells of incense and damp stone. A child kneels at the slab, tracing the carving with a finger. He does not know its origin, but he knows it belongs to him. That is how symbols endure, not by explanation, but by repetition. The quirky side of heraldry is its resistance to change. Families often clung to designs for centuries, proud of their antiquity. Yet the sudden introduction of new motifs, especially those with no clear marital justification, stands out. In some roles, heralds even scribbled marginal notes. Origin uncertain, not verified. These little hesitations remind us that even contemporaries sensed something odd in the quiet adoption of certain designs. Bedtime rhythm carries us into the notion that heraldry itself became a second genealogy. Where names were erased, symbols remained. A red stripe on a shield could carry more continuity than a name in ink. For children born into these houses, the crest was their inheritance, even if the story behind it was never spoken aloud. As this section slows toward its end, imagine the flutter of a banner over a castle gate. The wind carries it outward, the colors ripple, and travelers passing by see only beauty. But for those within, the mark means memory. It is the whisper of silence turned into paint. And beyond heraldry lies the next layer, not just colors and shapes, but relics buried in crypts, seals preserved in secret. Where arms could whisper, objects could declare. The story carries us underground into Burgos, where quiet stone and hidden seals wait to speak once more. The city of Burgos lies in northern Spain, its cathedral a forest of stone spires rising like frozen prayers into the sky. Beneath its crypts, centuries of nobility sleep under carved effigies, their folded hands resting on marble pillows. To walk there is to hear history in hushed tones, the echo of boots on stone blending with silence. And in the 19th century, during restorations, that silence was said to have broken into a whisper. The mainstream historical fact is simple. By the 1830s, antiquarians reported cataloging seals discovered in a church crypt near Burgos. Several of these seals bore designs that scholars associated with the long-suppressed Knights Templar. Accompanying them, according to reports, was a fragment of parchment with a peculiar line. Though our names have changed, the mark remains, for the name was never the power, the vow was. Whether this fragment was authentic or later interpolation remains debated, but its existence is documented. Catalog details are thin. Even proponents file it under provisional. Oh, the fringe detail is the setting itself. The crypt in question had been sealed for centuries. The restorers described finding crates with wax seals intact, their impressions crisp even after long neglect. Some bore the familiar red cross within circles. Others displayed symbols less well known, stars, roses, even geometric knots. The crates contained not treasure but documents, some illegible, some burned at the edges. The air smelled of mildew and ancient beeswax, and the workers claimed they felt watched, as if the dead themselves resented the intrusion. Such stories of atmosphere rarely make it into official reports, but they cling to memory like cobwebs. The debated element, unsurprisingly, is authenticity. Some historians argue the seals were genuine remnants of the Templar order, hidden by allies after the suppression. Others suggest they were medieval forgeries or later fabrications, planted to embellish family prestige. Still others believe the 19th century restorers themselves exaggerated their find, hoping to attract patronage and fame. The truth may never be known. Yet even uncertainty becomes part of the legend. The possibility that an oath survived beneath stone, waiting to be uncovered. Picture the sensory details of that crypt. The chill air hangs heavy, tasting faintly of iron. Dust motes shimmer in the light of lanterns. A crowbar pries open a wooden lid, and the smell of age escapes like a sigh. The workers lean in, their shadows long against the carved walls. They lift a packet of seals, the wax scarlet though dulled by time, and the impression of a cross stares back at them. It is a moment both ordinary and uncanny, the past reaching forward with a quiet hand. The motif of the seal returns here with renewed force. In earlier sections, it was an heirloom pressed into a nephew's palm, or a relic hidden in a dowry chest. Now it emerges literally, pulled from a crypt centuries later. The seal has become the voice of the silent, an impression that refuses to fade, carrying vows across time. A quirky anecdote circulates about the scholar who first handled the parchment fragment. He reportedly wept, declaring, "This proves they live still." His colleagues dismissed his emotion, noting the fragment might be a later monk's creation. Yet his tears are telling. Sometimes belief itself preserves continuity more than facts do. For bedtime listeners, that image of a hardened historian overcome by a scrap of wax and ink is far more powerful than catalog numbers or paleographic analysis. The debated question goes deeper. What if the message on the fragment was less a declaration of Templar survival than a reflection on lineage in general? The name was never the power. The vow was. That line could be read as a universal truth about families, orders, even nations. Names change, dynasties rise and fall, but the commitments people carry forward, faith, loyalty, memory, are what endure. Was it meant specifically for hidden heirs of the temple, or was it a broader monastic meditation, later misattributed? Each reading shifts the meaning, and each adds layers to the whisper under Burgos. Imagine standing in that crypt today. The marble effigies gaze heavenward, their features worn by centuries of candle smoke. Beneath your feet, the earth conceals countless forgotten coffins, and somewhere, perhaps, fragments of wax and parchment still lie sealed in boxes, too fragile to touch. You breathe in the musty air, and for a moment, you feel the vow. Not a vow you made, but one that echoes, as if walls remember what men forget. The quirky side of the story is how quickly the discovery slipped into obscurity. Though noted in 19th century accounts, the seals and fragment rarely appear in mainstream histories. Some suggest they were quietly moved into private collections, others that they crumbled beyond preservation. The silence surrounding their fate feels almost intentional, as if the whisper wanted to be heard only once, then vanish again. In Bedtime rhythm, the Burgos story becomes less about authenticity and more about atmosphere. It tells us that history sometimes reveals itself in flickers, like lantern light in a crypt. Too bright a gaze, and the image fades. Too careless a hand, and the wax crumbles. The whisper under Burgos reminds us to listen as much to absence as to presence. As this section softens to its end, we leave the crypt behind. The workers seal the crates again. The lanterns extinguish, and darkness reclaims the space. Yet the whisper lingers. Vows survive beyond names. Marks outlast words. And so the story drifts northward, carried by rumor and memory, into Scotland, where stones on windswept hillsides bear crosses too blunt and too broad to be mere ornament. The wind that sweeps across the Scottish Highlands has the sound of memory in it, a long, low sigh that bends the heather and carries with it stories older than any charter. In the scattered kirkyards of the north, where sheep graze between leaning stones, carvings emerge from the lichen. Crosses, wide-armed, blunt-tipped, their shape familiar to anyone who has studied the Templar sigil, stand etched into headstones centuries after the order was thought to have perished. The mainstream historical fact is that Scotland, in the early 14th century, became a place of refuge for outlaws, exiles, and wanderers. After the arrest of the Templars in France in 1307 and their official suppression in 1312, Scotland was uniquely situated. The papal decrees that dismantled the order were not fully enforced there, due to the country's strained relationship with Rome. Robert the Bruce, excreant Sadalf, Voltrines, Rochelle, excommunicated after killing a rival in church, had little incentive to obey papal demands. His kingdom, fighting for independence against England, was more concerned with survival than with the politics of heresy. Thus, Scotland offered a shelter, intentional or not, to those fleeing persecution elsewhere. The fringe detail blooms in folklore. The notion that Templar knights fought at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, charging beside Robert the Bruce's men and turning the tide. Chroniclers of the time do not confirm this, but later traditions insist on it, describing phantom banners with red crosses appearing at a desperate moment. Whether true or not, the legend roots itself in landscape. And in the centuries that followed, Highland gravestones began to bear crosses remarkably similar to the Templar pate. Some are crudely carved, others refined, but the resemblance is unmistakable. The debated question is whether these crosses truly signify Templar presence or are simply part of a broader medieval repertoire of Christian symbols. After all, crosses of various forms appear throughout Europe. The pate design, with arms widening toward the edge, was not unique to the temple, yet its concentration in certain Scottish cemeteries, especially those tied to clans with whispered connections to exiled knights, keeps the debate alive. Were these markers chosen because of aesthetic preference or because memory needed a home? Imagine the sensory experience of stumbling upon one of these stones. The heather presses close, Bees drone softly, and the air smells of peat and rain. The stone itself is rough, flecked with lichen, the carving shallow but still visible. A cross whose arms flare outward, catching the light of a gray sun. A local guide might shrug and say, just a cross. But to one who has traced the Templar emblem across manuscripts and seals, it looks like continuity. A cross can be a seal cut into stone, the old oath pressed into Highland granite where parchment never reached. The motif of the cross as echo grows here. Once painted on shields in the Holy Land, it now rests on humble burial stones in windswept fields. It is shrunk in grandeur, but expanded in intimacy. The cross no longer marks armies. It marks ancestors. It whispers not of crusade, but of kinship. A quirky anecdote appears in the archives of Rochelle. In the 17th century, a traveler recorded seeing a gravestone with a cross pate, accompanied by the motto, in hoc signo vinces, in this sign you shall conquer. This phrase, famously associated with Constantine's vision before battle, was also beloved by Templar lore. To find it paired with such a cross in the Scottish Highlands is curious. Did the Mason know the connection? Was it an intentional nod to a hidden lineage? Or was it simply a pious borrowing? The ambiguity is the charm. The debated element sharpens around clan traditions. Several Scottish families claim descent from or alliance with Templar fugitives. The Sinclairs of Rosslyn are most famous, but smaller clans also nurtured whispers. Their oral tradition spoke of ancestors who came from the East or with the Red Cross. Skeptics argue such claims were embellishments, constructed later to add mystique. Supporters counter that oral memory often preserves truths written records overlook. Which is correct remains uncertain, but the persistence of the claim is undeniable. Picture, if you will, a Highland funeral centuries ago. The mourners gather under low clouds, the pipes keening in mournful tones. The body is lowered into earth, and the stone prepared with its carving. The mason chisels a cross pate, perhaps because that is what the family requested, perhaps because it is simply tradition. The rain slicks the stone, darkening the fresh grooves. The mourners leave, but the cross remains, bearing silent witness to continuity. The quirky aspect of Scotland's role is that it became both sanctuary and symbol. For exiled knights, it offered literal refuge. For later storytellers, it offered romantic cover, a land beyond papal reach, where vows could survive. Even today, tourists wandering Highland cemeteries stumble on these crosses and feel a shiver, as if the landscape itself remembers what history tried to forget. In bedtime cadence, these stones become more than relics. They are lullabies in stone, each cross a note in a long, soft song of survival. They tell us that even when orders fall and names vanish, symbols can root themselves in the soil, blooming like heather across centuries. As this section closes, imagine leaving the cemetery behind. The wind rises, tugging at your cloak. On the horizon, a chapel's silhouette breaks the clouds. Within its walls, stone carvings hum with meaning, echoes that scholars dismiss as fancy, yet which draw pilgrims of imagination all the same. On a hill just south of Edinburgh stands a chapel whose stones seem too alive for their age. Rosslyn Chapel, built in the mid-15th century, is a jewel box of carvings, angels playing instruments, vines twisting into stone ribbons, stars and flowers frozen mid-bloom. Yet those who linger inside speak not only of what they see, but what they hear. Some say the chapel hums. The mainstream historical fact is this. Rosslyn Chapel was founded in 1446 by William Sinclair, Earl of Orkney. Its construction drew masons and craftsmen from across Europe, and its decorations reflect a mix of Gothic exuberance and local imagination. Among its most famous features are the apprentice pillar, carved in spirals of astonishing intricacy, and the angel musicians that line the arches. The chapel became, over centuries, wrapped in associations with the Knights Templar and later the Freemasons. Though neither claim is firmly documented, the fringe detail lies in the chapel's acoustic oddities. Visitors in modern times describe an uncanny resonance, as if whispers carry farther than expected, as if chants sink into the stones and return softened but intact. In 2005, researchers studying the chapel's carvings noticed something peculiar. Patterns on certain arches correspond to geometric representations of sound waves. The cubes carved along the arches, long considered decorative, have been interpreted by some as musical notation. Some musicians have attempted to play the carvings, treating the stone itself as sheet music. The melodies that emerge are haunting, minor, slow, like echoes of an unrecorded liturgy. The debated element surrounds the chapel's link to hidden traditions. Was William Sinclair deliberately embedding Templar or esoteric knowledge into the stone? Some argue yes, pointing to the Sinclairs' supposed role as guardians of Templar treasure after the suppression. Others dismiss this as later Romanticism, noting that 15th century Masons delighted in ornament for ornament's sake. The truth lies somewhere between. Rosslyn Chapel is undeniably excessive, even obsessive in its decoration. But excess itself is not proof of secrecy. It may be the product of devotion, ambition, or aesthetic zeal. Imagine the sensory immersion. You step into the dim chapel, its air cool and damp, carrying the scent of old stone and candle wax. Shafts of light strike dust, motes into gold. You place your hand on a pillar and feel the cold ridges like frozen waves. Then you speak softly, only a word, and it travels farther than you expect, gliding across the nave as though the building itself is listening. If you hum, the sound seems to return, not as an echo, but as a companion. No wonder people say the chapel hums. It feels less like an inanimate structure than a partner in song. The motif of sound carried by stone becomes crucial here. Earlier, symbols were impressions, wax seals, carved crosses. Here the motif evolves into vibration. The vow, once silent, now takes on resonance, humming through architecture. What was hidden beneath earth in Burgos, what was carved into Highland gravestones, now seems to sing. A quirky anecdote concerns the so-called Rosslyn motet. In 2007, composer Stuart Mitchell used the cube carvings as a code, translating them into musical notation. He and his father performed the piece on instruments depicted in the chapel itself: fiddle, trumpet, bagpipes, drums. The result was a haunting tune that seemed both medieval and alien. Critics argued the mapping of cubes to notes was speculative, but audiences found the effect mesmerizing. To sit in the chapel and hear its own stones sung back was to feel as though the building exhaled. The debated question lingers on the apprentice pillar. According to legend, the master mason forbade his apprentice from carving the pillar until he had studied abroad. While the master was away, the apprentice dreamed the design and carved it himself. When the master returned, he killed the apprentice in jealousy. The story echoes the themes of secrecy, revelation, and betrayal that swirl around Templar lore. But is the tale true? Historians doubt it, suggesting it was invented later to explain the pillar's unmatched beauty. Yet the legend persists, adding another layer of voice to the chapel's hum, a cautionary tale frozen in stone. For bedtime storytelling, Rosslyn Chapel is not just architecture, but an instrument. Its hum is the sound of memory refusing silence, of vows vibrating centuries later. The idea that stone can sing is comforting at night. It suggests permanence, yet also participation, as if buildings keep company with us when the world grows quiet. And so we linger in this humming chapel, its arches bending over us like an embrace. The Sinclairs built it, and their bloodline carried its mysteries. As we leave, the hum seems to follow, not fading but settling deeper, like a tone that continues even after the string is plucked. It is a sound that leads us to family, to lineage, to the stories carved not only in stone but in blood. And so we walk toward the next tale, where names and inheritances matter as much as vows. When the chapel doors close behind you, the hum of Rosslyn does not end. It lingers like a tone inside your chest, and that resonance belongs as much to people as it does to stone. To speak of Rosslyn Chapel is to speak of the Sinclairs, a family whose name threads through the tangled skein of Scottish history like a bright red filament. The story of their bloodline, wrapped in rumor and power, has been told as both history and legend. The mainstream historical fact is that the Sinclairs, also spelled St. Clair, were a prominent noble family in medieval Scotland. William Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, founded Rosslyn Chapel in 1446. His family held extensive lands, titles, and influence, bridging the realms of Norway, Scotland, and later Britain. They were builders, patrons, and politicians. The chapel, as ornate as it is, was a display not only of faith but of lineage, anchoring the family's place in both heaven and earth. The fringe detail lies in the Sinclairs' alleged guardianship of the Knights Templar's secret legacy. Some traditions claim that after the suppression of the order in 1312, fugitive knights fled to Scotland, where Robert the Bruce sheltered them. There, according to lore, they allied with the Sinclair family, who gave them refuge. In return, the Sinclairs inherited their treasure, or perhaps their wisdom. Later centuries would embroider this into tales of the Holy Grail, sacred relics, and secret scrolls hidden beneath Rosslyn Chapel. Whether these claims hold any truth, or are merely the inventions of a romantic imagination, they have given the Sinclair name an aura of mystery. The debated question is how much of the Sinclair Templar connection rests on fact. Skeptics argue that the family's prominence made them easy targets for myth-making. Their chapel, with its extravagant carvings, seemed to invite allegory. Yet others insist that oral traditions, passed down within the family itself, preserve whispers of something real. Did the Sinclairs genuinely guard relics of the temple, or did they simply enjoy being cast as keepers of an eternal secret? Imagine the sensory richness of lineage as lived in the Highlands. In the Rosslyn crypts, carved effigies of Sinclairs lie with their hands folded, armor etched in stone, swords beneath them. In Orkney, wind lashes the cliffs, where their castles once braved the sea. Their coat of arms, a cross quartered with roses, flies above doorways worn smooth by centuries. Each detail suggests continuity, a bloodline both rooted and restless. The motif of blood as inheritance takes form here. Where earlier motifs were of wax and stone, Now it is flesh itself that carries the vow. The Sinclair's story is one of blood remembered, blood claimed, blood mythologized. A chapel may crumble, but blood flows forward. A quirky anecdote emerges from the 18th century, tying the family to early Scottish masonry. With a Sinclair elected Grand Master when the Grand Lodge formed. This connection fueled theories that Freemasonry itself descended from Templar survivors via the Sinclair family. Masonic ritual, cloaked in symbolism, seemed to echo the secrecy of the temple, and the Sinclairs provided a perfect genealogical bridge. Whether coincidence or continuity, the association deepened their mystique. Another debated layer involves the Sinclair genealogy itself. Some historians argue that the family claimed descent from Norman knights who arrived with William the Conqueror. Others trace their roots to Scandinavia, noting their title of Earls of Orkney and ties to Norse bloodlines. Were they Norman aristocrats who became Scottish nobles, or Norse jarls who bent toward feudal power? Perhaps they were both. In that duality lies their magnetism. Conquerors and guardians, warriors and masons. The bedtime cadence of this story rests in imagining what it means to belong to such a lineage. Picture a child of the Sinclair family centuries ago, standing in Rosslyn Chapel as light spills through narrow windows. The carvings overhead are not just decorations, they are reminders of heritage. The hum in the stones is an inheritance. To such a child, identity would not be merely a matter of blood, but of expectation. To continue a legacy of secrecy, patronage, and mystery. Legends even tie the family to voyages across the Atlantic, long before Columbus. The tale of Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, sailing west to North America in the late 14th century, captures imaginations. Though the evidence is scant, proponents claim he reached Nova Scotia and left traces of Templar symbols there. If true, it would make the Sinclairs not only guardians of the past, but harbingers of the future. If false, it remains a powerful metaphor. A family always sailing into the horizon, carrying their myths like provisions. As the story slows for night, the Sinclairs become less about fact and more about resonance. Their bloodline is not a list of dates and titles, but a kind of music, a hum passed down through generations. It is the same hum you felt in the chapel, carried now in veins, rather than in stone. And as we follow that hum northward, across sea spray and wind, the trail leads us to islands where Norse sagas mingle with Scottish echoes. Orkney awaits, a place where blood and legend crash like waves against stone cliffs, where the Sinclairs ruled as earls and where their story deepens. The hum of Rosslyn fades, but the sound does not die. It transforms, lengthens, and carries northward on the wind. Follow it across rugged moors and salt-bitten roads until land seems to fray into the sea and you reach the islands of Orkney. Here the whispers are not carved in stone but carried in waves, gull cries, and the hollow moan of wind tunneling through cliffs. Orkney was the seat of the Sinclairs, a northern edge where Scotland tangled with Norse memory. The mainstream historical fact, Orkney was long under Norse rule, before passing to Scottish hands in the 15th century. The Sinclairs were appointed Earls of Orkney in the late 14th century, governing with Norse inheritances under growing Scottish suzerainty. Their power lay not only in stone castles like Kirkwall's Bishop's Palace, but also in their ability to mediate between Norse heritage and Scottish crown. They were both heirs and negotiators, standing on a threshold where sea routes mattered more than land. The fringe detail is whispered in tales of Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, who supposedly sailed west long before Columbus. According to the Zeno narrative, published in the 16th century, Henry led a voyage in 1398 that reached the shores of North America. Supporters of this claim point to supposed carvings in Nova Scotia, native oral histories, and uncanny symbols resembling Templar crosses. Whether true or not, the idea of an Orkney earl steering into the unknown fits the family's mythology. Blood that was restless, compelled to wander, carrying vows across oceans. The debated question, of course, is whether the voyage ever happened. Most historians reject the Zeno narrative as a later fabrication, cobbled from myths and mistaken identities. Yet the story persists because it resonates with the symbolic hunger of lineage. If the Sinclairs were guardians of secrets, why should those secrets not travel beyond Europe, into the wilderness of a new world? Even falsehood, repeated in salt air and candlelit chambers, becomes part of the family's echo. Picture the sensory world of Orkney, the cliffs of Yesnaby, where the wind howls like a living creature, the standing stones of Stennis, older than the pyramids, standing sentinel against centuries of storm. The sea churns green and gray, spitting foam against black rock. On long nights, when auroras ripple across the northern sky, the islands feel suspended between worlds, half Norse saga, half Celtic song. It is easy to believe that voices ride the wind here. Voices of jarls, monks, knights, and earls. The motif of whispers evolves naturally. If Rosslyn hummed like an instrument, Orkney whispers like a shell held to the ear. Whispers imply secrecy, intimacy, knowledge passed mouth to ear. In bedtime storytelling cadence, these whispers become the family's northern inheritance, not carved, not sung, but spoken softly across salt air. One quirky detail involves Orkney's folklore, tales of selkies, seal people who shed their skins to walk as humans. Local lore sometimes connected these sea folk with certain families, as though the blood of nobles might mingle with myth. It is said that some Sinclairs claimed kinship with the sea, that their line carried a hint of otherness. Perhaps this was metaphor for their seafaring ambitions, or perhaps it was the island's way of folding even its rulers into legend. The debated issue ties back to identity. Were the Sinclairs Norsemen who became Scots, or Scots who inherited Norse seas? Orkney itself never quite chose. Its language, customs, and place names carried both lineages. To rule here was to balance two bloodlines, two songs. In that balance, whispers were essential. Political whispers, family whispers, whispered oaths. Imagine now standing at Kirkwall, where St. Magnus Cathedral rises in red and yellow sandstone, one of the finest medieval churches in Scotland. Built by Norse hands, it later became a Sinclair seat of power. Within its walls, light filters crimson through stained glass, and footsteps echo on flagstones. To the ear, it is less a hum than a whisper, a low, steady presence. The Sinclairs prayed here, governed here, and from here looked westward, beyond the horizon. Bedtime pacing lingers on this horizon. For centuries, Orkney was less a destination than a departure point. Ships sailed from here toward Norway, Denmark, Shetland, even Greenland. If whispers filled these islands, they were whispers of departures. A son gone to sea, a secret promise carried on a long voyage, a legacy folded into the salt spray. The myth of Henry Sinclair's Western voyage, whether true or false, captures that longing. Imagine a night on the Orkney shore, the sea black as obsidian, stars overhead. A fleet lies at anchor, sails furled, men whispering of maps and omens. The Earl himself walks among them, cloak whipping in the wind. He places a hand on the prow of a ship, wood creaking beneath his palm. The whisper in the air is not just the wind, but the sea itself, urging him forward. As the story rests here, Orkney becomes more than an island chain. It becomes a threshold, a liminal place where whispers push outward. For the Sinclairs, this was not an end, but a beginning. Their blood, humming in Rosslyn stone, whispering in Orkney wind, was ready to be carried farther still. And so the wind rises, tugging at sails, promising oceans. The whispers do not fade. They stretch, stretching beyond sight toward lands unseen. The next chapter is not only about family, but about compass and course, about leaving the shore. The whispers of Orkney carry us further, but they do not travel alone. They arrive laden with another story, one that had already been centuries in the making when the Sinclairs rose to prominence. It is the story of the Knights Templar, not in their glory, but in their fall, in their exile, and perhaps in their survival. If Rosslyn hummed and Orkney whispered, then the Templar tale drifts like a sail catching ghost wind. The mainstream historical fact is clear. In 1307, under orders from King Philip IV of France, the Knights Templar were arrested, accused of heresy, and forced into dissolution by the Pope in 1312. Their properties were seized, their leaders tortured, and their Grand Master, Jacques de Molay, burned at the stake in 1314. In most official chronicles, the Templars vanish from history in this firelight. The order was destroyed, its power extinguished. That is the record. But the fringe detail insists otherwise. Legends tell of a Templar fleet moored at La Rochelle on the day of their arrest. When soldiers came, the ships were gone, vanished overnight. No one knows where they sailed. Some say to Portugal, where the order survived under new names. Others whisper they fled north, skirting the coasts until they reached Scotland, a kingdom excommunicated at the time and therefore beyond papal authority. There, it is said, they found refuge in the lands of sympathetic lords. One of them, perhaps the Sinclair family. The debated question, then, is whether this was true or only myth. Did Templar knights, armored and weary, ride north into the highlands? Did they kneel in Rosslyn crypts, swearing secrecy? Did they pass to the Sinclairs a legacy of relics, wisdom, or charts that reached beyond the known world? Or was this only an invention, a way to give the ruined order a shadow life that history itself denied them? Historians remain divided. Some demand hard evidence, others lean into the weight of tradition, the persistence of the tale. Picture it in sensory terms. Imagine the dark harbor of La Rochelle, dawn not yet broken. Soldiers' boots echo on the quay, but the ships that should be there are gone. Only empty water glimmers beneath the moon. In Scotland, picture winds over moors, cloaks drawn tight around hidden travelers. Imagine crypt doors closing, footsteps descending into the cold, and a silence thick enough to conceal any oath. In such images, bedtime storytelling lingers. The exiles are never fully seen, only half imagined, as though they move always just beyond torchlight. The motif of exile binds this section. Exile is not only about displacement, but about direction. Driven out, driven elsewhere, forced into movement. Exile requires a compass, whether literal or symbolic. The Templars in exile become a river of rumor, flowing outward and downward until it mingles with other lineages. The Sinclairs, already heirs of Orkney winds, are said to have caught this current. One quirky detail is the tradition among Scottish Freemasons that the Templars fought at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, aiding Robert the Bruce in his victory against the English. Bannockburn phantom horsemen live in tradition rather than the roles of chronicle. Though absent from official records, the story claims that mysterious horsemen charged into battle, helping to turn the tide. For those who believe, these horsemen were none other than Templar survivors. To bedtime ears, the image resonates. Knights in exile, still armored, still fierce, appearing like phantoms to alter a nation's fate. Another debated point lies in the symbols carved into Rosslyn Chapel. Some motifs, two riders on a single horse, for instance, echo Templar imagery. Others resemble Masonic emblems. Are these deliberate inheritances, proof of continuity, or merely coincidental borrowings by later stonemasons? Scholars disagree, but the power of such carvings is undeniable. They seem to whisper, "We were here." The pacing slows into metaphor. Exile is not only the Templar condition, it is the human condition. To be cut off from power, from home, from certainty, is to live in whispers. In Orkney, the wind carried family legends. In Rosslyn, the stones hummed. Now in the tale of Templars, exile becomes a vessel, always moving. Bedtime cadence paints one last image, a ship, lantern swinging in the night, sails heavy with damp. The sea is wide and no port awaits. On deck, knights whisper not of glory, but of survival. Ahead, only dark water and the faint pull of Polaris. Behind, the flames of persecution. They are exiles, yes, but exiles who carry something, a chest, a chart, or perhaps only an oath, that must be preserved. And so their path, real or imagined, becomes part of the Sinclair current. If bloodlines hum and islands whisper, then exiles drift, steering by compass. The legend does not close here. It unfolds, stretching outward like maps unrolled on a wooden table, ink lines reaching toward unknown coasts. The exiled knights fade into legend, but in their wake comes another object, quieter, yet just as enduring: maps. If exile is movement, then maps are memory of movement, ink on parchment that pretends to tame oceans. But in the centuries when Sinclairs and Templars threaded their tales together, maps were not instruments of certainty. They were fragile, speculative, often wrong. To read them now is to read dreams as much as directions. The mainstream historical fact is that medieval and early Renaissance maps were riddled with distortions. Coastlines stretched too far, islands floated where none existed, and entire continents were misplaced. Mariners relied on portolan charts for practical navigation, but scholars and rulers alike prized mappa mundi, maps that showed not the world as it was, but as it was imagined. These maps blended scripture, myth, hearsay, and rumor into geography. To step onto a ship with such a map was not to step into knowledge, but into faith. A fringe detail gives this theme a sharper edge: the so-called Vinland map, unveiled in the 1960s and claimed to be a 15th century depiction of North America, long before Columbus. Its ink, however, became a battlefield of scholarly debate. Some tests declared it medieval, Others exposed modern chemicals in the lines. If real, it would rewrite the timeline of discovery. If false, it would be one of history's most elaborate forgeries. Later chemical analyses fueled forgery claims. The debate itself became the map's truest coastline. The very uncertainty of the map echoes the sense of bedtime unease, a parchment whispering, "We knew," or perhaps we only pretended to know. Closer to the Sinclairs lies the debated Zeno map, published in the 16th century but claiming roots in the 14th. It depicts strange islands west of Scotland and hints at voyages led by Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney. Some argue the Zeno brothers fabricated the tale, weaving hearsay into fantasy. Others insist it preserves fragments of real expeditions, now lost to official history. For the Sinclairs, the map functions less as proof than as mirror. It reflects the desire for their name to reach past the horizon, to touch lands unclaimed. Imagine the sensory world of such maps: a candle guttering in a scriptorium, a monk's quill scratching vellum, salt-stained fingers unrolling a chart on a damp ship deck. The ink runs where spray has touched it, coastlines blur, and still the navigator leans close, as though the map might whisper directions. In bedtime rhythm, maps are not tools of mastery, but companions of longing. They show not where to go, but where the heart wishes to go. One quirky detail lies in how medieval cartographers filled blank spaces. Rather than leave oceans empty, they drew monsters, serpents, whales, lions of the deep. On the Hereford Mappa Mundi, Africa is populated with strange creatures, half human, half animal. In these spaces, fear and imagination intertwined. A sailor did not simply see unknown waters. He saw dragons. The phrase, "Here be dragons," became shorthand for such uncertainty. It was less geography than psychology inked onto hide. The debated issue ties back to whether maps can carry secrets. Could families like the Sinclairs have preserved hidden charts, passed down in whispers, showing lands beyond the accepted world? No historian has produced such evidence, but the allure lingers. After all, why should power not reside in a folded piece of parchment, locked in a chest? To bedtime ears, the image resonates, a map hidden in stone walls, a key passed hand to hand, ink fading, but meaning alive. Bedtime cadence lingers on metaphor. A map is a paradox, both presence and absence. It shows where you might go, but always imperfectly. It marks islands that vanish, seas that stretch too far, rivers that never flow. To hold such a map is to admit uncertainty. In this way, the Sinclairs' supposed maps are not tools, but symbols. Symbols of possibility, of yearning, of journeys that might or might not have happened. Picture now a wooden table in Orkney or Rosslyn, candles pooling light. A Sinclair unrolls a chart, its edges curled, its surface patched with drawings. He traces a finger westward, over lines that end abruptly in blank space. There, in the blankness, lies his imagination. There, too, lies the bedrock of story. For it is always in the unknown that legends take root. As the story rests here, we linger in that blankness. Maps end. Oceans begin. The compass points outward, steady but inscrutable. It is the same moment sailors faced when they stared into the horizon, the sense that the world could end or begin just beyond sight. And so the ink fades, but the dream remains. Maps to nowhere are not failures. They are invitations. They do not close the tale, but open it wider. drawing us into seas untold. Beyond their edges lies the Atlantic, restless and waiting. Maps end in silence, but ships do not. They push their prows past inked edges into waters no cartographer dared to fill. To speak of the Sinclairs is to step from parchment into waves, from candlelight into starlight. For legends insist that in 1398, nearly a century before Columbus, Henry Sinclair, Earl of Orkney, sailed west across the Atlantic, carrying with him secrets of Templars, whispers of maps, and the burden of exile. The historical fact that grounds us. By the 14th century, European seafaring was no longer a gamble of guesswork. The clinker-built ships of the Norse, with overlapping planks and high bows, had already reached Iceland, Greenland, and Vinland centuries before. Sailors understood the Gulf Stream's pull, the prevailing winds that curved across the Atlantic. To cross was perilous, yes, but not unimaginable. The northern routes were cold, storm-ridden, yet dotted with stepping stones of land. Scotland's sailors, hardened by the North Sea, were not strangers to such danger. Dead reckoning, soundings, and stars did the quiet math these routes required. The fringe detail transforms this into legend, the claim that Henry Sinclair himself made the crossing. According to tales woven through the Zeno narratives, Sinclair sailed with a Venetian navigator, perhaps following half-true charts, perhaps driven by whispers of lands west. They say he reached Nova Scotia, or even Newfoundland, erecting markers, mingling with native peoples, leaving traces in stone. A nightly fleet, sails cracked by salt, anchors dropped in bays that would later welcome Cabot and Columbus. In bedtime rhythm, the scene shimmers. Torches burning on a wild Atlantic shore, armor glinting in moonlight where no European armor should be. The debated issue remains whether any of this is true. Skeptics insist the Zeno account is fabrication, a Renaissance attempt to graft grandeur onto old names. They point out the absence of hard archaeological proof, the silence of indigenous oral histories, the inconsistencies of dates. Believers, however, hold fast to fragments, carvings in Westford, Massachusetts, said to be a knight's effigy, stones etched with crosses in Nova Scotia, oral tales of pale strangers from the sea. Between fact and fiction, the legend drifts like a ship half seen in fog. Sensory imagery keeps us afloat. Imagine standing on deck, cold spray stinging your cheeks, the creak of timbers, the stars unfamiliar yet constant. The compass quivers, but Polaris steadies you. Ahead only a horizon that refuses to end. At night, the sails whisper with wind. By day, the sea stretches like hammered silver. Every sound is amplified. Gull cries fading, ropes straining, men's prayers muttered low. This is not the heroic crossing of triumph, but the anxious lull of survival. Each mile, another question. One quirky detail rests in the Norse sagas. Long before Sinclair, tales spoke of grapes in Vinland, of turf houses built on unknown shores. These stories, carried orally, might have reached Orkney, mingled with Sinclair lore, and inspired voyages anew. It is possible Henry Sinclair was not first, not singular, but a continuation of an older path. For bedtime ears, this layering deepens the hum. Voyages are never alone, but echoes of echoes. Another debated fragment lies in Nova Scotia itself, where later centuries birthed the Oak Island mystery, hidden treasure pits, supposed Templar relics, rumors of buried knowledge. Though most evidence points to later diggers and dreamers, Some storytellers fold Sinclair into the prologue. Did his fleet leave something there? Not treasure, but a trace, a cross, a map, a stone? Or is Oak Island only a mirror of human longing, a hole dug into desire itself? Metaphor slows the pacing. The Atlantic is not simply an ocean. It is a mirror of exile. To leave Europe's shores was to abandon safety, to seek direction in absence. Compass and exile fuse here, a needle pointing outward, a destiny pointing away. Henry Sinclair, whether or not he crossed, becomes a symbol of this impulse, the need to imagine, to attempt, to risk. Picture now a quiet cove on the American shore. The forest presses close. The air smells of pine. Strange figures step onto sand. Knights in mail, sailors in wool, eyes wide with awe. They do not plant flags, nor build colonies, nor leave names carved deep. They simply arrive, linger, and vanish, like a dream, half remembered. Perhaps it happened. Perhaps it did not. But in the bedtime cadence of history, the possibility is enough to let us drift. And so the Atlantic swells in our imagination. Maps to nowhere become maps to somewhere. Exile becomes arrival. The compass spins, then steadies, pointing not homeward but forward. The story does not settle in harbor. It sails onward toward Vinland, where echoes wait. The sea does not forget. Waves roll stories forward, carrying them like shells polished smooth. To step beyond the Atlantic crossing is to set foot upon Vinland, a name whispered in sagas, inscribed in lore, and half buried in earth. For here, more than in maps or rumors, history and legend touch. The echoes are faint, but they linger like distant bells in mist. The historical fact stands firm. Norse settlers reached North America around the year 1000. At L'Anse aux Meadows in Newfoundland, archaeologists uncovered turf houses, iron nails, and the remnants of boat repair. These were not inventions of dreamers, but fingerprints in soil. Vinland was real, even if fleeting. The Norse built, stayed, and left. For 5 centuries, the memory dimmed, waiting for other ships, other names, to claim it again. The fringe detail enters when local indigenous traditions are woven into this fabric. Among the Mi'kmaq of Atlantic Canada, tales tell of strangers arriving from the sea, pale-skinned, bearing tools of metal and cloth unlike their own. Some modern interpreters claim these tales preserve echoes of Norse contact. Others, more romantically, suggest they might remember later visitors, perhaps even Sinclair's supposed knights. In bedtime cadence, such voices shimmer like echoes in a shell, indistinct yet haunting. The debated issue is whether such oral traditions truly refer to Norse or later Europeans. Memory across centuries shifts like sand. When missionaries and chroniclers recorded these stories, they often reshaped them through their own biases, seeing what they wished to see. Were the men from the sea true memories, or shadows cast backward once European presence became undeniable? The question lingers unresolved, yet it is precisely this uncertainty that breathes life into legend. Sensory rhythm grounds us. Imagine Vinland not as a map point, but as a sensation. The scent of spruce, the bite of northern air, the sound of waves striking a rocky cove. A Norse longhouse smokes in the cold, its roof heavy with sod. Children peer toward the forest edge, where unknown eyes watch in silence. The clash of cultures does not thunder. It whispers, it flickers, it leaves faint traces, like footprints half washed by tide. One quirky image lies in the very name Vinland. Early Norse sagas claimed it was a place of wild grapes, a land of sweetness. Scholars debate whether this was literal grapes or a mistranslation of pasture land. Yet the symbol remains Vinland as abundance, as promise, as a new world already dreaming itself into myth. For bedtime ears, the image of vines curling along unknown shores offers softness amid salt and storm. Another debated fragment arises from stone carvings and crosses scattered across New England and Nova Scotia. Some enthusiasts point to them as evidence of medieval European presence, linking them to Sinclair's voyage. Most scholars reject these as later colonial remnants or misinterpretations. Still, to a sleepy imagination, the stones themselves become echoes, mute witnesses, resisting certainty, waiting for stories to be projected onto them. Bedtime cadence invites metaphor. Vinland is not merely land, it is an echo chamber. Where vellum once held a seal, the tide holds the impression of a landing. Here, then gone. Every voice that speaks of it, from Norse saga to Mi'kmaq story to Sinclair legend, resonates differently, yet all point westward, outward, away. It is the symbol of possibility, the shimmer of a land that both was and might have been. Picture now a twilight shoreline. The Norse fire has burned low. Across the water, faint drums echo from the forest, answering the crackle of embers. Centuries later, Mi'kmaq voices recall strangers from the sea, their memory shaped by retelling. Centuries after that, antiquarians in Europe read these echoes as proof of knightly voyages. The sound grows fainter with each distance, yet still it is heard, an echo of Vinland, never fully silenced. And so Vinland becomes less a place than a rhythm, pulsing through history. The Atlantic carried not only ships, but stories, each layered upon the other. For those who seek the hidden, Vinland is a mirror, reflecting both what once was and what we long to believe. The echo lingers as the tale turns. For what is an echo but a call awaiting answer? Beyond Vinland lie symbols carved in stone, marks that may or may not prove who came and why. The shore fades into forest, and in the trees a cross waits. A shoreline without maps is still a shrine. For when the sea delivers strangers, they bring not only sails and anchors, but symbols carved deeper than memory. Among these, none speaks more softly yet insistently than the cross. To plant a cross in unknown soil was to claim, to bless, to orient. In the murmur of history, the cross becomes more than wood or stone. It is a compass of belief, an emblem of exile, turned into presence. The historical fact is clear. Christianity followed the prow of every medieval voyage. Norse explorers carried not only axes, but crosses, as shown in Greenlandic ruins, where small chapels stood beside turf houses. Missionaries, often traveling with traders or settlers, brought the sign of the cross wherever ships touched. By the 14th century, the cross had become Europe's most portable architecture, erected in distant lands long before cathedrals. To imagine Vinland or farther shores, without it would be to strip Europe's sailors of their most constant companion. The fringe detail is etched, quite literally, into stone. In Westford, Massachusetts, there lies a weathered carving on a rock ledge. To some, it is nothing more than scratches of glacier and time. To others, it is the Westford Knight, a figure of a medieval warrior, sword at his side, cross-shaped hilt unmistakable, Local lore claims this knight was a fallen member of Henry Sinclair's voyage, buried far from home, his likeness memorialized in stone. Tourists still visit, tracing their fingers along faint lines, as if by touch they might revive the past. The debated issue surrounds this carving's authenticity. Many archaeologists dismiss it as natural weathering, patterns of stone, mistaken for artistry. Others argue it may have been colonial-era graffiti, centuries after the supposed Sinclair expedition. Believers, however, see detail too deliberate to ignore: a helm, a sword, a cross. To them, the Westford Knight is not chance but testimony, the mark of Templars carried to the New World. Between skepticism and faith, the carving remains a silent witness, offering no confirmation. Only the patience of glacial scratching being read as armor. Sensory detail keeps us rooted. Imagine walking through Westford at dusk, the air heavy with pine, the rock cool beneath your hand. The lines are shallow, almost imperceptible, yet once seen they cannot be unseen. The knight gazes outward as though across centuries, a sentinel guarding not land but legend. The smell of earth, the rustle of leaves, the fading light, all conspire to make the carving seem alive, ready to step free and walk again. Another curious detail lies in Nova Scotia, where carved crosses and mysterious stones dot the landscape. Some link them to Sinclair, others to later settlers. Yet in bedtime cadence, these symbols blur together, a lattice of belief, etched again and again, as though the New World itself demanded a cross upon its brow. Debate swirls endlessly. Was the cross planted here as faith, as claim, as comfort? Or is the New World cross only a projection of Old World longing? Scholars argue in papers, local historians defend traditions, and visitors lean in close to the stone, each seeing what they wish. This tension itself becomes part of the story, the cross as an echo chamber, reflecting the hearts of those who gaze upon it. Metaphor slows our pace. The cross is more than a sign of faith. It is a point of intersection between old world and new, between certainty and doubt, between history and legend. It stands at the crossing where one path ends and another begins. To imagine a knight's cross in America centuries before Columbus is to dream of continuity, of presence long hidden. Whether true or not, the cross becomes a symbol of that yearning. Picture now a burial. A knight lies beneath unfamiliar soil, the forest pressing close, the ocean far behind. His comrades, weary, carve his likeness into stone, not for glory, not for conquest, but so he is not erased. A sword, a cross, a silhouette, fragile against time, yet strong enough to whisper across ages. Whether carved or imagined, the image persists, as steady as Polaris in the northern sky. And so the cross of the New World is less artifact than story. It does not demand belief. It invites reflection. To touch it is to touch not certainty, but wonder. For bedtime ears, the cross is a lullaby, part prayer, part question, part promise that somewhere, somehow, the past still breathes. The symbol lingers, pointing onward. If the cross was planted, what else was carried? Relics, treasures, secrets perhaps? Beyond stone and carving lie whispers of hidden vaults, of mysteries buried in earth. The cross casts its shadow toward treasure, and the story bends that way. The cross in the forest casts a long shadow, and shadows make treasure hunters of us all. Where a symbol stands alone, we imagine a vault beneath it. Where a story ends in silence, we listen for the clink of coins under earth. In the wake of Vinland's echoes and the night cut into stone, the tale bends toward chests and crypts, toward the sweet ache of a map that promises more than it tells. Treasure is always a lullaby for the waking mind, a promise that something lost still waits with its eyes closed. The historical fact we can touch is this. By the late 18th and 19th centuries, Oak Island in Nova Scotia became the stage for one of the world's longest-running treasure searches. Pits were sunk, pumps clattered, cofferdams groaned against the sea. Syndicates formed and failed, new machines arrived with new hopes. Men pulled up timbers, coconut fiber, bits of metal, and layers of mystery. Decade after decade, the island received diggers like a patient host. And yet, this is the hard edge. No academic consensus has ever confirmed a Templar cache beneath those pines. 2 centuries of digging have found stories in abundance, certainties in short supply. The island yields stories with more enthusiasm than it yields proof. The fringe detail slips in with a whisper from across the Atlantic. At Rosslyn, rumor insists that a sealed vault beneath the chapel holds knights entombed upright in armor, swords sheathed, faces turned toward the east. Another tale says that when the order broke, a portion of its reliquaries, chalices, seals, perhaps even a parchment of names, crossed the sea and were hidden not in a cathedral but under a simple hill. Some versions send the chest to Orkney, some to Nova Scotia, some to the mouth of a New England river. The chest itself never stays still. It migrates through the imagination like a migrating star. The debated question arrives with the clatter of modern finds. On beaches and in muddy shafts, searchers have lifted a scatter of objects that set hearts racing. Old coins, fragments of chain, a weathered lead cross pulled from the shallows. Are these medieval? Colonial? Theater? Archaeologists urge caution, pointing to contamination, to trade routes that could have spread European metal long after the 14th century, to the human tendency to see patterns where none were intended. Believers, on the other hand, hold each artifact like a candle in a crypt. Even a small light, they argue, can prove a room exists. Picture the sensory mood of a dig by lantern. The air smells of peat and brine. Planks creak over a shaft as buckets rise dripping black water. A coil of rope leaves damp marks on the boards. A spade's edge hits wood, then something harder. Men lean in. What emerges might be only a nail, only a buckle, only a bead of lead. But in night's hush, even small metal sings. It is not just the thing itself. It is the vibration of hope running through it. The motif of key and lock slides into our palm. In earlier chapters, we found keys without doors, relics that belong to rooms already erased. Treasure myths reverse the image. Doors without keys, vault mouths without the phrase that opens them. Oak Island is an endless riddle of locks. Flood tunnels become legends in their own right. Trap systems, like the sly grin of the sea. Rosslyn's rumored vault is the opposite, perfectly sealed, perfectly still. A silence that refuses invitation. A quirky footnote clings to parchment. Among late 19th century clippings, you sometimes find a diagram labeled with cipher letters, promising a route from a shoreline boulder to a money pit, marked by an old oak. The cipher looks ancient. The paper is not. Yet these amateur cryptograms are part of the charm. They function like lullabies for grown men, rocking them toward the dream where the next morning's spade will finally ring on the lid of something that confirms the whole story. Another debated curve of the legend is the Grail itself. Some thread the Templar myth with Arthurian string, insisting that the chalice of Christ was carried north and then west, wrapped in silence, guarded by blood rather than walls. Others protest that the Grail is literature, not logistics, a symbol of spiritual desire misread as cargo. Still, bedtime cadence lets both sit in the same room. One is the cup, one is the thirst. Together, they explain why we keep digging. Let the atmosphere slow. Imagine a small wooden chest on a table in a candlelit room, the kind used for ledgers and seals. The lid opens on bundles of wax impressions, a folded scrap with a red cross in a circle, and a letter written in a cramped, hurried hand. There is no gold, only authority, only the ability to create realities in ink. We forget that such a chest might be worth more than coins. A seal could move land, forgive debt, anoint a successor. If treasure survived, perhaps it survived not as glitter, but as governance. Yet the earth likes shiny stories. So we return to the pits and the vaults, to the water that keeps returning, to the boards that keep collapsing. Oak Island teaches a simple truth in a complicated way. The more we seek a single answer, the more tunnels we create. Every failure breeds a new theory, and each theory leaves behind another story, another layer of sediment in the collective mind. The island becomes a palimpsest, diggers rewriting each other's sentences in wet soil. In this lull, the seal returns, the oldest of our traveling companions. Suppose that somewhere a signet still exists, passed down through a sober family that never speaks above a whisper. Suppose the seal has been pressed not onto treasure maps, but onto marriage contracts, land grants, quiet agreements to keep watch over particular shrines. The greatest treasure, then, is not a chest, but a chain of signatures reaching from a ruined Paris commandery to a modern parlor where an heir knows exactly which drawer to open. Let the night gather. We are tempted to demand a lid, a cache, a count. But bedtime stories resist tallies. What they offer instead is continuity. Treasure in the Templar key is anything that carries a vow forward, a seal, a scrap, a cross, a rumor held firmly enough to outlast ridicule. The cross in the New World is one such coin. The sealed room at Rosslyn, whether empty or full, is another. Even the island that refuses to confess is a kind of reliquary, holding our collective hunger carefully out of reach. As candles gutter, we turn from pits to portraits, from vault mouths to velvet shields. Because while some sought continuity in earth, others stitched it into color and shape. Across oceans and centuries, a small red cross keeps appearing in the same quarter of the same family's arms, stubborn as a star in foul weather. The spade rests, the herald's book opens, and a different kind of treasure, one that cannot flood, rot, or rust, begins to gleam. Heraldry is a language written in color and form, a field of symbols where memory survives not in ink, but in shape. When a knight's body could not cross an ocean, his cross could. On banners in stained glass, carved into lintels and stitched into surcoats, the simple geometry of the Templar Red Cross traveled farther than the order itself. The heart does not remember in paragraphs. It remembers in patterns. The historical fact: in medieval Europe, heraldry followed strict rules of quartering, dividing a shield into fields to show descent and alliance. A noble might display his father's arms in one quarter, his mother's in another, a marriage bond in the third, and a claim or honor in the fourth. These were not mere decorations. They were contracts of color, the visual genealogy of power. Over centuries, coats of arms multiplied like family trees, each quartered field holding the story of a union or conquest. The fringe detail whispers that in parts of colonial America, certain families bore arms with a stubborn red cross in the same quarter, generation after generation. And because new worlds breed new ambitions, some families assumed arms they admired. Caution is a lantern we carry while reading these colors. The shield might evolve, animals added, fleur-de-lis embroidered, chevrons bending across, but the cross stayed in its corner. Legends claim that descendants of men who once sheltered the Templars carried those arms to Virginia, to Massachusetts, to the Carolinas. Was it pride, coincidence, or an oath carried invisibly across the sea? The debated point is this: do such heraldic echoes prove anything about the order's hidden survival? Scholars argue that crosses are among the most common symbols in European arms. That persistence of a red cross in one field may be statistical noise. Others counter that the precision of placement, always quartered, always in the same corner, feels less like accident and more like coded persistence. Yet heraldry itself straddles the line between art and archive, making certainty elusive. Picture the shield as a night sky. The gold field is dawn, the blue is deep water, the red a sun at setting. Lines divide the cosmos into knowable quadrants. Each animal stands like a constellation, each charged like a star. In this celestial map, the red cross is the pole star, guiding without moving. For a listener drifting toward sleep, heraldry becomes a quiet planetarium of meaning, its colors pulsing softly against the dark. One quirky aside: medieval rolls of arms sometimes included fanciful beasts, from dragons to mermaids. A knight could quarter his lineage with a creature no one had ever seen, provided it held symbolic weight. Imagine a colonial family preserving a quarter with a red cross opposite a mermaid, a symbol of seas crossed, promises drowned and renewed. Did the mermaid mark an actual voyage or a dream of one? The shield itself becomes a bedtime riddle, inviting us to read across generations. The motif of the constant corner returns. In architecture, a cornerstone fixes a building's alignment. In heraldry, a quartered corner fixes memory. To keep a red cross always in the same space is to mark an anchor point, a vow that no amount of new unions can erase. It is the quiet persistence of identity, a cross pressed like a seal into each new alliance. Yet heraldry was never immune to invention. In the 18th and 19th centuries, wealthy families sometimes assumed arms they had no legal claim to, borrowing grandeur to polish their status. Here lies the debate. If we find a red cross quartered in New England, is it a survival or a fabrication? Is the family an heir of vows or an heir of aspiration? The record books cannot always tell, but the lull of uncertainty is itself part of the story. The shield gleams even when its metal is uncertain. Now let us slow the pace. A colonial parlor lit by a single candle. Above the mantel hangs a framed watercolor of a coat of arms, its pigment faded, its cross still red. Children drowse as their grandfather traces each quarter with a finger, telling stories not of Europe, but of ships, forests, rivers. He does not name the Templars. He does not need to. The cross in its corner speaks a language older than his own. Here, the symbol and the myth converge. The shield is a kind of chest, but one that opens visually rather than physically. Its treasures are marriages, vows, loyalties. Unlike the Oak Island pit, it floods with meaning instead of water. Unlike the Rosslyn vault, it is not sealed but displayed openly. And yet both require a key of interpretation. We, the watchers, must decide how much to believe. As night folds deeper, the coats of arms shimmer like fields quilted together. Each square tells a story. Each border whispers of boundaries crossed. The red cross in its corner becomes less a mark of possession and more a lantern left in a window, burning for centuries so a wandering knight might find his way home. Whether he ever returns is beside the point. The light is what matters, and so the shield becomes bridge. From the quartered fields of Europe to the woodlands of America, from knights in armor to children in parlors, from parchment rolls to bedtime whispers, the cross endures not as proof but as presence. A corner kept constant is itself a kind of ritual. That ritual does not end at the shield. It seeps into the forest, into the pines where men gathered in secrecy, drawing patterns not on heraldic parchment, but in the dirt itself. There, under branches that creaked like vaulted ceilings, a different kind of quartering took place, not of shields, but of space, of ground, marked sacred by silent oaths. The forest at night is a cathedral without walls. Pines rise like columns, their needles whispering when the wind moves, their resin carrying a sharp sweetness that clings to memory. Step into such a wood, and the air thickens. Every sound is softened, every light swallowed. It was here, according to fragments of rumor and hints in journals, that secret gatherings once took place in the young colonies. The historical fact: societies like the Freemasons often met in taverns, halls, or upper rooms of public houses in the 18th century. Their rituals involved symbols of geometry, oaths of brotherhood, and ceremonies of initiation. But when privacy was not available, or when symbolism called for it, rituals were said to have shifted into the outdoors. Forest clearings became their chambers, stars their ceiling, fire their altar. This is not invention, but extension. Freemasons valued natural symbolism, and the pine, evergreen and enduring, carried its own weight. The fringe detail lingers in local legends, torch-lit circles deep in the woods where men in aprons or dark cloaks gathered, chanting phrases half Latin, half English. Trees bore carved marks, sometimes crosses, sometimes compass and square motifs. Travelers told of stumbling on rings of burnt ground, as if a small sun had briefly burned there. A few even claimed to have seen coded letters etched into bark, initials arranged in quadrants, echoing the heraldic divisions of Europe. Was it genuine continuation of Templar rites, or colonial men cloaking their fellowship in older myth? The debated point remains unresolved. Some historians assert that the rituals of early American Freemasonry were fully derived from the European craft guild tradition, reshaped by Enlightenment ideals, with no true Templar residue. Others suggest that fragments, ritual phrases, emblematic crosses, stories of persecution and survival had seeped into the ritual fabric, carried unconsciously like genetic memory. Did the men in those forests believe they were inheritors of a crusader's vow? Or were they only weaving a romance around their fellowship? Imagine it now, softly, as though you stood there with closed eyes. The pines sway. A ring of men form a perfect circle, each holding a candle whose flame bends in the night air. At the center, a stone serves as altar. Upon it, a small chest, empty perhaps, yet symbolically vast. Words are spoken slowly, so slowly they sound like heartbeat. When one flame gutters, another hand shields it until it steadies, and that gesture, small, human, protective, becomes more powerful than any sword raised in daylight. One quirky detail: colonial newspapers occasionally printed accusations that groups met in forests to perform heathen rites, equating them with witches. But in truth, many of these men were judges, merchants, craftsmen, hardly sorcerers. The secrecy was less about magic and more about privacy, about the dignity of mystery. To neighbors, however, secrecy itself was suspicious, and suspicion grows well in the dark. Thus, a meeting of men with candles among the pines could stir rumors of deviltry, even when their talk was of geometry and brotherhood. The motif of the pine deserves pause. Evergreen. It defies winter. Its resin was used to seal, to preserve, to purify. In folklore, pine needles scattered on a floor kept away evil spirits. To conduct rituals in such a grove was to borrow sanctity from nature itself, to align human vow with the persistence of the tree. A pine circle was less a hiding place than a chosen sanctuary. Yet ambiguity endures. In New England archives, one can find lodge records written with careful clarity, dates, names, dues paid. Beside those, oral traditions of forest rituals sound like shadows embroidered onto plain cloth. Which should we trust? The official ink or the whispered memory? Perhaps both, for stories often carry the emotional truth even when factual certainty is lost. Ledger clarity by day, candle rumor by night. The record and the whisper rarely shook hands. The scene transforms in imagination. A colonial boy hiding behind a trunk, eyes wide as he spies the flickering light. He does not understand the words, but he feels their weight. Decades later, he tells his grandchildren that in the pine grove he once saw knights, not neighbors. And so the myth grows, rooted in personal awe, watered by the human need for legend. Symbols repeat here as they did on shields. Circles echo quartered fields, candles echo crosses, oaths echo vows once sworn before kings. Whether or not a Templar lineage runs through these woods, the symbols themselves create continuity. A man stepping into the ring of light is not only joining his peers, but entering a story older than himself. Let the listener rest in this image. Flames glowing among trunks, resin scent rising, night birds calling beyond the circle. The ritual may be real or imagined, documented or apocryphal, but in the quiet retelling, its purpose becomes less about history and more about reassurance, that communities find ways to bind themselves, that vows survive where light survives. And when the last candle is extinguished, the grove does not fall silent. Instead, the hush feels consecrated. The ground remembers the circle, the pines keep vigil. Symbols remain even after men depart. It is this persistence of symbol, rather than fact, that invites us deeper into the story. From these whispered rites beneath the trees, our attention shifts toward language itself. the secret alphabets and ciphers said to veil messages across centuries. If a symbol carved into bark could conceal a vow, what might lines of letters hide on parchment? The forest rituals fade like smoke, leaving us before the threshold of codes and riddles, the next chamber of the tale. Ink upon parchment can feel more enduring than stone. A forest ritual, no matter how solemn, fades when the last flame gutters, but a cipher written in deliberate strokes may outlast centuries, whispering across time to any who hold the key. The world of the 18th and 19th centuries was a place in love with secrecy, and among the brotherhoods and lodges, codes became a natural extension of their veiled identities. The fact is clear: Freemasons popularized what came to be known as the pigpen cipher, a simple yet ingenious substitution system where letters were replaced by fragments of grids and shapes. It appeared in their manuals, carved discreetly into cornerstones, and scratched into personal notebooks. It was not only functional but symbolic, its angular marks resembling architectural lines, tying language to the craft of builders. But then come the fringes. In Virginia and beyond, rumors circulated of treasure maps written in cipher. The famous Beale Papers, published in the 19th century, claimed to reveal the location of hidden wealth, encoded so thoroughly that even today 2 of the 3 ciphers remain unsolved. Were these papers genuine or fabricated to enthrall? Their mystique fit neatly into a cultural atmosphere that already half believed in Knights' secrets buried beneath American soil. Whispered tales connected the Beale treasure to Templar gold, carried across the Atlantic and buried beneath the New Republic's mountains. No proof emerged, yet the story endures, like a flickering lantern seen far off in the trees. Whether hoax or honeyed lure, they perfectly matched a culture already tuned to old-world echoes. The debated question presses: were these ciphers vessels of ancient Templar knowledge, a continuation of vows written in veiled script, or were they purely modern inventions, a means to foster fraternity and exclusivity among men who prized mystery? Most historians lean toward the latter. Codes were practical tools, ways of creating belonging and boundary. Yet symbols have a way of gathering shadows. A cipher of squares and dots can look like a map of the cosmos, or a battlefield, or a shield divided into quarters. To those inclined to see lineage, such shapes are never neutral. Picture the scene. A man sits by candlelight in a colonial study. The shutters are drawn. On his desk lies a sheet of parchment, letters replaced by strange diagrams. He dips his quill, ink glistening as it pools in corners of the grid. Outside, the wind bends pine branches, the same trees that hosted whispered rituals. Inside, the marks seem to move in the flicker. A private universe only he and his brothers understand. The cipher is both barrier and bond. A curious aside, during the Revolutionary War, ciphers of all kinds flourished. George Washington's spies used numerical codes and invisible ink to pass messages. Benedict Arnold's betrayal involved coded correspondence. The use of secrecy was not limited to brotherhoods, but woven into the very birth of the nation. Thus, a cipher in a lodge book might echo one in a military dispatch, blurring the line between sacred vow and practical survival. The motif of light and shadow returns. A candle reveals ink, yet also threatens it with smoke. A cipher glows briefly when decoded, but remains dark to all others. Symbols scattered across a page resemble constellations, stars waiting to be joined into shapes by imagination. In this, the act of deciphering becomes an act of storytelling, where the reader supplies the narrative the symbols alone cannot provide. Debate continues even among modern cryptographers. Some argue the Beale papers were an outright hoax, created to sell pamphlets. Others maintain there may indeed be something beneath the soil, something waiting for the right key. Similarly, scholars of Masonic tradition disagree whether the Pigpen cipher ever carried esoteric meaning beyond substitution. Was it just a clever game, or did its geometric divisions echo the quartering of shields, the mapping of sacred space? Symbols recycled themselves across time. What was once a knight's cross becomes a surveyor's diagram. What was once a war banner becomes a page of code. And so, even without proof of Templar continuity, the resonance lingers. The American fascination with hidden codes owes as much to inherited myths as to pragmatic needs. One sensory image remains strong: the silence of a study when the cipher is finished. The writer leans back, hearing only the faint crackle of candle wick, the soft scrape of tree branches outside. The page before him is unreadable to strangers, yet it hums with significance. It is a silence louder than speech, an echo of vows whispered in forests, translated into symbols on parchment. Perhaps this is the last cipher of our story, not a single message waiting to be broken, but the recognition that every symbol, every ritual, every flame in the night was itself a code, a way for men to belong, to bind themselves to something older, grander, even if the lineage was imagined. The true key is not found in grids or numbers, but in the need to keep mystery alive. And so, as we fold this page, the ink still fresh in memory, we turn toward a softer horizon. The ciphers fade into silence, just as rituals fade when candles die. Yet in the hush, symbols remain, waiting like constellations overhead. They will guide us into a gentler close, where the story itself becomes a lullaby. The halls of secrecy do not collapse in a single night. They fade, one ritual at a time, until the echo of voices is all that remains. By the late 19th and into the early 20th century, fraternal orders flourished across American towns. Insurance lodges, Masonic halls, benevolent societies. While the most Baroque medieval airs quietly thinned, the myth dimmed. The meeting nights endured. Ceremonies survived even as Baroque medieval airs thinned, trading Crusader romance for civic routine. And yet, the strange persists. Even today, in quiet corners of rural America, small societies linger. A rented hall, a locked drawer, a candlelit ceremony that feels displaced in time. These are not the powerful networks conspiracy theorists imagine, but rather small gatherings of men or women who find comfort in continuity. The quirky detail here is that some of these groups still use passwords, handshakes, or symbolic regalia with origins claimed, if not proven, from the medieval past. The world outside may move at digital speed, but within those halls, the rhythm of centuries persists. The debated question lies at the heart of our journey. Did the true influence of the Templars ever genuinely flow into the New World? Or is it all projection, fragments of European imagination grafted onto American soil? Scholars argue. Some dismiss the idea entirely, labeling it an imported myth, while others point to recurring symbols in architecture, in early Masonic rites, in coded documents. suggesting that at least the idea of continuity mattered more than factual proof. The truth may remain locked, a cipher that resists resolution. Symbols, however, do not need proof to survive. A cross carved into stone may be misinterpreted, yet still inspire. A candle extinguished in one century may be relit in the next, meaning drifts, like smoke, shaping itself anew with each generation that inhales it. This has been the pattern. Rituals inherited, disputed origins forgotten, symbols repurposed for comfort, identity, or myth-making. Imagine standing in an empty lodge now, long after the brethren have departed. The wooden floor creaks beneath your steps. Dust catches faint light from a high window. The banners are rolled, the regalia packed away, but on the wall remains a single carving, an emblem whose edges are softened by age. On the wall, a quartered shield keeps a constant corner, red as a banked coal. It no longer commands authority, but it still carries presence. That is how history often endures, as residue, as a hushed reminder rather than a loud proclamation. In a locked drawer, a small signet waits, ink long gone, authority now only memory. In such silence, echoes can feel louder than voices. The motif of candlelight returns once more, a flicker against walls, the glow upon a faded manuscript, the dying ember of tradition. It is in the silence, when the last participant has gone, that you realize what secrecy really meant. Not power, not hidden treasure, but belonging. A circle drawn to keep meaning alive in a noisy world. And now, slowly, we must let the pace soften, as if drawing curtains across a stage where the play has ended. The final quarter of our tale becomes less about fact and more about feeling, less about proving and more about surrendering to quiet. You, listener, have walked through forests of ritual, stood among symbols, deciphered codes, and watched centuries unfold. You have carried a lantern through shadowed halls. It is time now to set that lantern down. Here begins the wind down, the slow descent into dream. The last flicker of flame hovers in your mind, and with it the certainty that all stories eventually rest. The knights, whether real or imagined in these American woods, have long since vanished. Their armor is rusted, their banners tattered, yet the idea of them remains, like a lullaby passed from mouth to mouth. You may close your eyes and still see their silhouettes, not as warriors, but as guardians of mystery, as symbols of the human longing to belong to something greater than oneself. Breathe in the silence of the empty lodge. Feel the cool air settle around you. Hear the distant night beyond, where owls stir and rivers keep their steady course. The story itself becomes part of that rhythm, slower, softer, stretching across the quiet. The quirky persists even here. Did you know some lodges in the Midwest still conduct candlelit initiations? Their members donning robes stitched by hand, their chants borrowed from half-forgotten European texts? To an outsider, it may seem quaint, even strange. To them, it is continuity, the echo of vows they believe are older than their own bloodlines. And yet, questions remain unanswered. Were the Templars truly here in spirit, or are we gazing at shadows on a wall, mistaking shapes for figures long gone? The answer does not matter in this hour. The important thing is the echo itself, the sense that history hums within us, even when certainty eludes. Let the story slow. Let the symbols fade. Let your breathing match the rhythm of the tale's descent. The ink dries upon the last cipher. The pine forest settles into quiet. The banners fall still, their colors muted in the dark. The hall empties. The candle gutters once, twice, then rests in smoke. And in that smoke is your final image, the sword left sheathed beneath the pine, the vow unspoken but understood, the story fading like morning mist. Sleep well. You have walked far enough.